where, hey, we've got a nice new, there it is. We've got coming up next is Aaron Gulyas, a Contactee Countdown, top most influential or fun UFO contactees. That's coming up in just a few minutes. That makes me, and I see Aaron is there in the waiting room. So I want to play something because Aaron's coming up. So let me see if I can switch this over here and play you something. I bet he'll recognize this. Not many other people will, but check this out.
And I brought with me some songs which have come through, I understand, from the space people, and they have a content which I would like to share with people, for I think there's a lot in it that you will understand when you hear. Thank you. There's a cockeyed feeling in the world today. The power of politics is here to stay. The China, Russia, and the USA. Boy, don't let them fool you. Take a look at this world of ours. Just one mud ball in the sea of stars. Oh, the planets not no color bars, 'cause they've got perspective. Yanks and Ruskies put men into space, but it's all a mad politician's race. What upmanship in this year of grace, it makes you giggle. The population stands and stares, while men in capsules explore upstairs. Why we can't even manage our own affairs. Some cheap colonization. Decide they got people on Venus and Mars. They got lads and lasses, they got cars and cars. They got better transports than four-wheel cars. Have you ever seen them? Those flying saucers whistling through our skies must take some power to make them rise. But government departments just hide their eyes. Call them meteors. With all the lies that they print and shout, the general public has its work cut out. Figuring what it's all about, but just you keep on trying. Suppose you know why I'm telling you this, so you won't shriek or shake your fist when you discover Martians do exist. They're real nice fellas.
I see by the newspapers here that Kraft Ericke, head of the Space Flight Division of the American Rocket Society, he recently says man must prepare soon to meet with intelligences of other solar systems. You know, there are many that feel that this has already happened. Now, with the voluminous file of photographic evidence that we have on hand, it is quite possible that they may...
Nope. That goes into another video. Anyway, that is actually the opening credits for a documentary that we were going to show at the 2001 National UFO Conference here in Austin, Texas, called, I believe, Contact. Oh, I just had it. Where is it? Contact UFO, Alien Abductions. And it featured researchers like Bud Hopkins, John Mack, David Gottlieb, Betty Hill, Eddie Bullard, Mark Roediger, Walt Webb, Michael Swords, and others. I just think that Contactee is adorable, and I love that song. And I think it may be Lenora Croft. I'm not really sure. I know I've had like Greg Bishop and others educate me on who that is specifically. But anyway, we're gonna just a real brief announcement. So yeah, we're still at the $10,000 mark. We could really use your support. We're halfway to our goal. We have a long way to go. That is the good news, that we are halfway through the Streamathon, starting the second half, the third, the fourth, fifth, and sixth Streamathons these Saturdays, today and next Saturday and the Saturday after that, all to raise our annual budget of $20,000, which was to cover mostly our rent at our current location. However, we did get the less than good news a week and a half ago or so from our landlord that we are not, in fact, going to be able to renew the lease at our current location. So we are hunting for a new location. So if you're in Austin, or you know somebody in Austin with real estate information, or you just drive around and you see something that's like, that's the perfect place for a weird library, please send an email to me and our organization at contact@anomalyarchives.org, or you just go to the website. You can find the contact links there, and we'll be glad to hear from you. That's how we found out about this wonderful location that we've been at the last 3 years. Was one of our email newsletter subscribers said, hey, there's this great location. So really hope that you'll consider supporting us by helping us find a new location. So folks, we'll be back in just a minute. You can also support us with...
May I please have your attention? I would like for you to see the Anomaly Archives poster. It features many creatures and artifacts from the stranger reaches of the globe and beyond. First, you will find a cryptid named Patty, an elusive creature rarely caught on film, but here immortalized borrowing books from the archives. An MIB is seen in the background doing what we can only believe is deep research into our files. A ghostly apparition has appeared and is seen reading a book about a very scary subject. At regular intervals about the archives, the poster also features forgotten treasures and mystical symbols. The longer you stare at the poster, the more fantastic things you will find. To view it long after the video has ended, visit the archives shop, where you can find it emblazoned on t-shirts, posters, and other household objects. Thank you for your attention.
So yes, you can go to our merch store. You can find a link on our website. You'll see all kinds of great stuff, hoodies, shirts, coffee mugs, mouse pads, and actual just posters of that wonderful artwork by Red Pill Junkie from absurdbydesign.com. So, all right, we're going to be back in just a moment. We're bringing on Aaron Gulyas in just a little bit, so stay tuned.
Up next, Aaron Gulyas presents Contactee Countdown, Top Most Influential or Fun UFO Contactees.
All right, everybody, welcome back. This is Miles Lewis, and you are tuned in to week 4 of the Anomaly Archives Streamathon Fundraiser series. And our next presenter is Aaron Gulyas. I first became aware of him several years ago, and have just been so glad that I was made aware of his work. He's published a number of books, and he has a fantastic podcast that I've been listening to religiously for so long. Aaron Gulyas was born in Indiana in 1975, raised on toy-themed cartoons, game shows, and Star Trek reruns. He has, nonetheless, achieved some sort of success in his life. Gulyas received his BA in history from Hanover College in 1998 and promptly went to work for the state of Indiana, assessing disability insurance claims. Wearing out his welcome in the civil service within a year or so, he shifted to the thrilling world of proofreading. Realizing he was only really good at history, he returned to school and was awarded an MA in United States history from Indiana University, Indianapolis, in 2003. He then moved into teaching, eventually landing at Mott Community College, where he has taught since 2006. Gulyas has presented numerous scholarly papers at conferences for various organizations, including the American Culture Association, the Popular Culture Association, and the Educational Technology Organization of Michigan. He's contributed to numerous history education, to numerous history, education, and popular cultural resources. His first book, Extraterrestrials and the American Zeitgeist, Alien Contact Tales Since the 1950s, was published by McFarland in 2013. He has also contributed a chapter to Doctor Who in Time and Space, Essays on Themes, Characters, and History and Fandom, 1963 to 2012. About the ways in which fan expectations shaped the 1996 and 2005 revivals of the classic science fiction series. He lives near Flint, Michigan, with his wife and son. And Aaron, sorry, Gulyas, I am just going too fast for myself. How you doing, Aaron?
Good. How are you?
Pretty good. So, did you recognize that Contactee? I think she's either British or South African. I'm not sure.
I recognized her. I can't place her, but I've heard the song before. I'm not sure. I've heard the song. I'm not sure I've seen the video that accompanies it, but I've heard the song.
So I was Googling for information about it earlier, and I mentioned, what is it, Contact UFO Abduction or whatever, being the title of the video, and it has a bunch of classic black and white UFO Contactee conference footage, and there is an archive of it with some of the original archival stuff, so should be able to find it. Cool. So looking forward to digging into that, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about what Contactees you find the most interesting, fun, and influential.
Yeah, I was winnowing the list down until a couple hours ago, still trying to figure out who to leave out. Sad.
Well, we should get you set up here, and
let me share my screen, and let me do this first. I will do that, and then I will do this, and then I will do that. And are my slides showing up?
There we go.
Okay.
Great. Well, I'll let you have at it.
Okay, and I of course hit the button to move to the second slide before there was the title slide. Well, hey everybody, thanks for being here. Thanks for watching this, whether you're watching live or on some sort of delay, and thanks for being here for all the topics at the Anomaly Archives Streamathon here in 2020. And like Michael said in his talk, I urge you to donate if you can to the Anomaly Archives to help them continue doing their good work of preserving the history of all of this weirdness that is out there in the world that we need to keep an eye on. And these materials that they collect are vital to understanding the history of these events and experiences and the organizations and the personalities. So if you can, please help out. Today we are doing a Contactee countdown of sorts, and you'll see why I say of sorts, because I'm unable to make hard decisions about some of my favorite contactees. So we'll see what happens. So as I was introduced, I'm a writer and historian and a podcaster, but mainly a history teacher. That's really what I do most of the time, and the rest of this is an increasingly time-consuming hobby, including the writing. It's if you break it down to a per hourly rate, it's definitely in the hobby category. But I am a history teacher, so if this is like one of my classes, then that's probably why. So, first question we need to examine and look at before we get to the countdown is, what is a contactee? Because these things have different definitions. We could say a contactee is anybody who's had contact with an anomalous thing, but that's incredibly broad. So we could say, well, it's somebody who has had contact with something claiming to be an extraterrestrial. Still, that's kind of broad because there's different categories, right? Vast difference between what you see in like that really cool book of humanoid encounters from 1973 that I think the Center for UFO Studies put out, and something like more modern abduction tales. There's a difference there. So, what's a contactee? For our purposes, the definition is one of those people who has had some kind of not just encounter, but generally some kind of ongoing relationship with a being that claims to be from elsewhere on the earth. And these contacts can be physical, sort of face-to-face encounters, or they can be psychic or telepathic in some way. You can have spiritual encounters. You can have things that are very akin to channeling or automatic writing. Contactees have a number of sort of hallmarks to them when we sort of use this definition, and in many cases, if not nearly all cases, the contacts involve not only tales of what life is like on other planets, but very didactic instructions for how humanity here on Earth needs to basically get its act together and leave the cosmic kindergarten, to use a metaphor that is often brought up in contact stories, that Earth and humanity are sort of at the lower level of where humanoid beings should be spiritually and politically and ethically, and that all civilizations pass through these phases, and if they don't destroy themselves, they will rise to a higher plane of existence, and we too can be like the Venusians or the Martians or the Saturnians. The contactees also often have very sort of trenchant and current things to say about political and economic and social conditions on Earth, which leads me to the next question before we get to the countdown itself. Why contactees? Why contactees today? Why contactees in general? If you listen to the Saucer Life podcast, or if you go check it out at saucerlife.com, what you'll notice is that while we cover a number of topics, contactees show up quite a bit, almost as much as weird, goofy internet culture from the 1990s. So why contactees? It's because I think contactees not only provide us with entertaining and interesting stories about how people have dealt with anomalous encounters and what anomalous encounters they've had over the last, coming up on 70 years, but also it's because of those messages they convey from their otherworldly friends. Those messages about what's wrong with American society, what needs, or other societies that they live in. We'll have an example of a non-American society, but what's wrong with the society that the contactee lives in, how that society and humanity in general can change. That provides us a valuable glimpse into various historical and cultural contexts of the time. So as a history teacher, as a history guy, I think that makes the contactees a valuable source of information and insight into particular aspects of from the stuff I generally study, largely American culture in the Cold War. So I think they're a valuable lens through which to examine Cold War history. Honestly, I think for me, that's where most of my interest lies. I'm not entirely thrilled about determining whether or not this person or that person in particular did go to Venus or Mars or set foot on a spaceship. So that's what contactees are for our purposes today. That's why I think contactees are interesting. And now the countdown, and this is where I sort of hedge a little bit. It's a countdown in no particular order. I couldn't. It was hard enough to get this down to. I got 6. I wanted it to be 5, but I just couldn't chop any of the last 6 after I chopped a bunch of others. So it was hard enough to decide who to include in this sort of overview of my top 6 contactees. I could not bring myself to rank them in order. In order of what? In order of how much they entertain me personally, in order of what I think their significance is to the UFO field. A countdown, in ascending order of who I think was the most honest or the least honest. That's difficult to do, and gets us into the realm of making judgment calls about how honest or dishonest particular experiencers were being, which is not what we do on the show necessarily, nor what I do here. So there is don't impart to this any sort of ranking, except for the first one, because I did put the most important one first, and that is George Adamski. George Adamski was born in, I think, 1891. I don't have it written down in front of me, but 1891 in Poland, comes to the United States as a young man. Ends up in California, serves in World War I. He's buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C. You can go see his tombstone. He settles back down in California after the war, and throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s, he builds an organization called the Royal Order of Tibet, which is sort of a kind of watered down theosophical sort of outfit. He would say later, according to some accounts, that in the 1930s, he would, when prohibition went out of the law and drinking became legal again, rather, he would say later that if it hadn't been for the end of prohibition, he wouldn't have had to get into flying saucers, because he was making money sort of bootlegging wine for sacramental purposes. He had special permission to have wine during Prohibition because it was part of the Royal Order of Tibet's ceremonies. And once that boondoggle was gone, then he had to find another grift. But George Adamski would get into amateur astronomy and astronomical photography. In the 1930s, he would write various books and pamphlets, including Satan, Man of the Hour, about the negative direction humankind is going. He would write some treatises on what he called cosmic philosophy that are going to sound very familiar to those who read his later Contactee books. And in 1949, he would write a science fiction novel called Pioneers of Space, in which a group of American astronauts would travel around the solar system, meeting the Martians and Saturnians and the Mooninites who live on the moon, and learn all about their far superior civilizations. And then he started photographing other things in the sky. And he would later write that on November 20th, 1952, he had an encounter with a blonde being in a sort of silvery jumpsuit who had landed his flying saucer craft in near Desert Center, California. Adamski and some friends were out for a picnic in the desert, as one does, and he would meet the spaceman and have a telepathic conversation. Well, not telepathic, but not verbal. He sort of said it was through gestures, but I'm not sure that entirely works to the level of detail that Adamski had in this conversation. Basically, in his first written account of this encounter, which was published in the book Flying Saucers Have Landed a year later, that the Venusians were very worried about the effects of the nuclear weapons that mankind was developing. Adamski would write his longest book, Inside the Spaceships, I think that came out in 1956, I believe. And this is his sort of in-depth account of his travels in the spacecraft with the Space Brothers, as he would call them. And this would sort of be one of the standard terms that contactees would use. Adamski, why is he on this list? We can call him the first contactee, but the things he experienced and the things many of these contactees experience are not sort of unique to contactees. There were others who had claimed to have physical meetings with flesh and blood beings who were more advanced than us. In the 1930s, the example that always comes to my mind is Guy Ballard, who started the IM movement. He met the Count Saint-Germain on Mount Shasta back in the 1930s, and there's no flying saucer involved, but it reads a lot like a standard UFO encounter. So Adamski wasn't the first to have this kind of experience, but his story links this sort of mystical visitation from somebody more advanced, that sort of genre of story, links it with the flying saucer thing, and establishes what I think we can consider an archetypal flying saucer contactee experience. Nearly every other contactee we're going to look at today has a story that is very much patterned on Adamski's original encounter. Although, as we'll see, they often date it earlier than November 20th, 1952, in a never-ending arms race of trying to declare themselves to be the first contactee. Another reason why Adamski sort of is number one and first, and sort of have to talk about him before you talk about any of the others, is that Adamski was massively popular. I'm not sure there's a good way to quantify his popularity compared to other contactees in this era of the 1950s and 1960s, but I will say this: he traveled all over the world and gave lectures, from Europe to New Zealand to Central America, in Mexico, in all over the place, in front of, I think it was Queen Juliana of the Netherlands. He met her. He had study groups established all over the country, and other contactees would as well. Daniel Fry, for example, had an organization that had chapters all over the place. But I mean, there is still today the George Adamski Foundation, run by people who take his claims very seriously and defend his claims on their website, and who are very, I found this out when I wrote my book on the extraterrestrials in the American zeitgeist. They are very, very, very picky about who they give permission to use George Adamski photos. And when you do get permission, after swearing up one side and down the other that what you're writing is not an attempt to debunk or mock Adamski, they supply the photos complete with a George Adamski Foundation watermark that they insist is on there. So I don't think there are many other contactees whose followers in 2020 are still as sort of tenacious about the reputation of their person. Probably the closest thing would be something like the Aetherius Society that contactee George King established. But Adamski's groups, we do have an episode, I forget the name of it, but it was a couple years ago. We sort of examined sort of the aftermath of Adamski's connection with the Flying Saucer Study Group in Detroit, Michigan, and there was a woman there named Laura Mundo, who was Adamski's sort of person on the ground here in Detroit. And she was a huge fan of his. They later had a falling out, but she ran a study group that somebody reported to the FBI for being communist in nature. So the FBI shows up, and the FBI really is like, these people are just flying saucer nuts. We don't think if these are the communists, we don't have to be worried about the communists if this is who they're sending. So he was massively popular, and I think that popularity was never really eclipsed by any other contactees. But there are contactees whose ideas have lasted through today, such as the next person on our list, George Van Tassel. George Van Tassel began receiving transmissions from the Space Brothers in January 1952, and he will continue writing until the early 1970s. And Van Tassel was significant, and makes a top 6 list. Terrible number, a top 6 list for a number of reasons. One is because he was sort of one of the first contactees to sort of really popularize the sort of channeled messages from the Space Brothers, but also because of the things he built and established that would last a long time, and some even to this day. Like in the picture over here on the right in the bottom, you see a structure called the Integratron, which he supposedly built on the instructions and with the guidance of the Space Brothers. And who were these Space Brothers? Who told him about the dangers of nuclear weaponry and the problems with all of this violence and warlike behavior in the United States and around the world. It was a group called Ashtar Command, and he would channel a number of I say it's a crazy cast of characters. It really is. There's Ashtar, who's in charge of a fleet of ships that are basically protecting the Earth from malign outside influences, so that the Earth and the human people can achieve their future together. And if necessary, if things do blow up, the Ashtar fleet will be there to sort of take everybody who's pure away to start life anew somewhere else. It's the flying saucer rapture, basically. But in addition to Ashtar, who was in command of this fleet, Van Tassel would channel a number of other people. One named Klaatu, spelled differently from the character in The Day the Earth Stood Still, but still Klaatu. Cthulhu, and many other space alien brothers who share names and identities with a lot of, if you're familiar with various ascended master spiritualist tradition, there's a lot of overlap there, right down to the channeling. And one last sort of lasting impact of George Van Tassel's work is the establishment of the giant rock flying saucer conventions that took place in Giant Rock, California, near some place in California that people know that I don't, because it completely slipped my mind. But there's a giant rock out there, and that's where they had conventions where basically everybody who was anybody in the flying saucer world would show up and give presentations up until I think into the late 60s, into the mid to late 60s. Those continued. And I think a final sort of piece of significance for George Van Tassel is that because the Ashtar messages are channeled, you can sort of claim to be a channel for Ashtar, and really, who's going to say you're not? Unless they want to denounce all channels of Ashtar. It leaves it a little more wide open. And so, to one degree or another, people have been channeling Ashtar ever since. Even at the same time Van Tassel was channeling messages from Ashtar, other people would get involved as well and say, I heard this from Ashtar as well. So that provides independent confirmation of what Mr. Van Tassel is saying. There would be an acrimonious split between various factions of Ashtar belief in the 1950s and 60s over the question of to what degree there should be a profit motive to the publication of Ashtar messages. If you've seen an Ashtar book and you're of a certain age, like my age and a bit older, you've probably seen books like, with this Ashtar Command logo, books like Project World Evacuation and Ashtar, a Tribute, that were compiled by a woman named Tuella, who called herself Tuella. She looks like the sweetest little old lady in a church basement you've ever seen in your life, and she was the main channel of Ashtar during the 1980s. There are people, once the internet comes along, it seems like everybody is channeling Ashtar. You can see examples of Ashtar channeling, penetrating various areas that really sometimes have nothing to do with UFOs. I think probably my favorite is when I started to see Ashtar, or people channeling Ashtar, who had messages from the Space Brothers about the great currency revaluation and the Nasara scam that became popular in about 10 years ago or so, 10, 15 years ago. So, when that's part of the problem with channeling is you can't really control the message as well, because people will claim to channel things. Next person on our list, Orfeo Angelucci. Orfeo Angelucci is another California contactee, and if I'm remembering this correctly, he at one point worked at, I think, the same aircraft plant that George Van Tassel did. He certainly worked at the same aircraft plant as another contactee, and I think it was Van Tassel. He, Orfeo Angelucci, claimed that his first encounter took place in 1952, and his encounters and his story, it's incredibly complex. And this is probably the only time I'm going to just come out and say, for a lot more information about Orfeo Angelucci, I really urge you to listen to the episode about him we did, because it's a complicated story, because the first version of it comes out in magazines the first one is as a self-published pamphlet, and then his story comes out in a magazine, and then he tells it in a couple of books that were edited by Ray Palmer, who was involved with the Shaver Hollow Earth stuff back in the 40s and was one of the first sort of big shots in flying saucer publishing in the 1950s. And the different iterations of the story, from the self-published pamphlet through the Ray Palmer books, see the story get more and more detailed and complex with each telling. And what's really interesting about a couple really interesting things about Angelucci's contact experiences are that, one, he talks a great deal about the physical pain and debilitation he's experienced through his whole life, through some medical issues, and he is treated and helped in these things by the Space Brothers, but he is not cured completely, because his pain is also a motivator in some ways. And the other thing that always sort of comes up with Orfeo Angelucci is that on several occasions, the Space Brothers give him to drink what he calls a nectar. It's a beverage, and it's they drop a pill in his drink, and it sort of dissolves and swirls around, and he drinks it and experiences, well, the doors of perception are opened, and he understands more and more deeply. And this has led some people to look at Angelucci's story and say that he is clearly sort of undergoing some kind of hallucinogenic substance event, and people have connected it to, I think Nick Redfern wrote an article or two on this, and if he didn't, it sounds like the sort of thing he would write anyway. That Angelucci might have been an early victim of some kind of MK Ultra style mind control experimentation, which is an explanation that I think is interesting. Interesting to look at from a speculative point of view. But Angelucci's story, what's the books, I mentioned this in the episode that we did on him, the books are incredibly sort of dense, and they are, for me, they were a struggle to get through, and a struggle to sort of distill into something that works in a 45 to 60 minute podcast episode, much less 1/6 of my presentation time for a Contactee countdown. But I wanted to make sure to mention him because it's an interesting story, and it's the textures and sort of imagery he brings up are very evocative. In one of his first encounters, he's alone in a ship that's being controlled remotely, and he sits in a chair, and he's in this chair, and the lights change inside the ship, and he hears music. And the way he describes this, it's different from just about any other Contactee story that I've seen. It's much more richly described than many. And then when he's on the planet Venus with his alien friends, then it gets a little tedious. But when it's good, it's some of the most evocative Contactee writing out there, which is something that we really can't say about our next person. But he's significant, if nothing else, because he might be the only Contactee where everybody remembers the name of the Contactee way more than they remember. Let me start that sentence again. He's odd for a Contactee because everybody remembers the name of the alien more so than the name of the Contactee. Everybody who's interested in this stuff, or even tangentially, has heard of Valiant Thor. Not as many people remember that Reverend Frank Stranges was the man who brought Valiant Thor to the masses. Frank Stranges had been interested in UFOs, flying saucers, throughout the 1950s while he was working for, I think it was called the International Evangelism Crusade, as a preacher. He wrote articles for flying saucer magazines and digests before he published any sort of contact account. I've got one magazine that has an article, Preacher, What About UFOs? Something like, What About Flying Saucers? Where he says, well, how should Christian clergy respond to parishioner concerns about flying saucers? And it's actually a pretty reasonable, interesting article. But then later, he reveals in some of his writings, including probably the book he's best known for, Stranger at the Pentagon, that in 1959 he met Valiant Thor, the stranger at the Pentagon. And Valiant Thor was a space brother who was, high up in his organization, and he had been sent to Earth, to the United States, to meet with American leaders and provide guidance and information on how to achieve peace and modernize our technology and economy. And he was sort of housed at the Pentagon for, I think, 3 years. And he met with both President Eisenhower and Vice President Nixon and sort of shared what he was willing to teach them. And the end result was that Nixon and Eisenhower both said that these revelations from Valiant Thor would upset the American economy, and so they had to, politely decline his offer of help. But what's some fascinating things about Valiant Thor is that Flying Saucer magazine photographer Augie Roberts, who was, pals with Gray Barker, who played a lot of jokes. Augie Roberts claimed that one of his photos at one of Contactee Howard Menger's meetings in New Jersey actually showed Valiant Thor and two of his crew members, the much less interestingly named Jill and Don, the space people. So I think Valiant Thor might be the only space brother we actually have a photograph of, or at least, the one that has a photograph that a lot of people have seen. Stranges would be active in the UFO field for a very long time, up until his death in the 21st century. I can't remember what year he passed away. I don't want to say because I can't remember, but he was pretty interesting, and also he revealed later in his life that the late Robert F. Kennedy was very interested in UFOs, and that Bobby Kennedy in 1968 asked Val Thor if he should run for president, and Val Thor said, "If you run for president in 1968, it will be tragic. You should wait until 1972." but Kennedy, of course, did run in 1968 and was assassinated. So Valiant Thor, we should listen to Valiant Thor. He has wise words for us. Okay, next, Elizabeth Clarer. Elizabeth Clarer had a contact experience in her native South Africa in 1956. And her story, as it was published in, I think, Flying Saucer Review or another British publication in 1956, 1957, was very straightforward. She was near her home in South Africa, and she saw a flying saucer, and it landed, and she met a man named Akon, and he was from an advanced civilization, and he urged humanity to be peaceful, and then he left. And that was pretty much the story. And then in 1980, she publishes a book called Through the Light Barrier that expands on this story quite a bit. Because it turns out that not only did she meet Akon, the spaceman, who's in the picture behind her there, but she and Akon were lovers, and he took her onto the spaceship and impregnated her, and she had a son who was Akon the alien's son, and someday, she said, he would return for them and they would join him. And it's wild. And it's an interesting story. And the thing is, for me, that's the least interesting part of the story. It's a romance novel. It's very much not a novel, but it could be a romance novel. It's almost a dry run for some of these very sort of weird, poorly written alien romance novels that you see out there on Amazon and stuff. Because what's interesting about the story is not just the alien human interbreeding part of the story, but we've got a book that was published in 1980, written in the 70s, about an encounter that takes place in 1956. And the 1956 encounter very much focused on general sort of contactee themes of war and peace. The 1980 version, the threat that humanity has to avoid, according to Clarer, is not nuclear war. The problem is there is going to be a race war, she says, which is this is a late middle-aged white woman in South Africa writing in the 1970s, concerned about a race war. This is the point she's writing at the point where the apartheid regime in South Africa is not crumbling, but is under increasing international pressure. And so her book is very much, it's got a very colonialist feel to it. The native African people she comes into contact with are presented very much as sort of, noble, mysterious savages who have their own tales of the space wagons or the star wagons or the sky wagons who come. And how do we know why does Akon pick Elizabeth Clarer to bear his alien child? Because she's blonde and thus shares a genetic link to his own advanced people. So this is, and that sort of angle is not something that's completely absent from contactee things by any means, but Clarer's book makes it much more of a focal point. It's an interesting book, and it's an interesting story, more for the context from which it comes than the content of the story itself. And looking at the time, I think I timed this really, really well, and I'm glad I went with 6 people and not 5, because we've got number 6 here, and this one I couldn't cut him. I couldn't cut him. I wanted to, but I just couldn't, and that is Reinhold Schmidt. Reinhold Schmidt is not a guy who will show up on the list of most people's lists of top contactees in any way, unless it's a top 10 shadiest contactees ever. Reinhold Schmidt claimed to have an encounter in Nebraska on November 5th, 1967. He was out, he was a grain buyer, he was out inspecting some fields, and he claims to have seen a flying saucer. It lands, he visits it. The crew members speak with German accents, and they invite him onto the flying saucer, which has, this is my favorite part, they serve him coffee from it's a normal percolator coffee pot, except it doesn't have a cord because it's powered by the same technology that fuels the ship. He has this encounter. He publishes up a pamphlet about it, and he goes on the lecture circuit with mixed results over the next few years. He has some pretty big audiences with some fellow contactees such as Daniel Fry, but as I discuss in the episode we did about him, there's a hilarious newspaper story from 1960. He did a lecture at a high school in California, and most of the crowd were high school students. And during the question and answer session, these high school kids just take his story apart. They take apart his physics of space travel he talks about. They take apart his sort of ancient alien stuff about Egypt, because he says, I saw the book from the pyramid and it was written in English. And they point out that English hadn't been invented yet. It's very funny, but he's making money off this, and he's doing okay. And he'd been going on additional flying saucer journeys with the space people, because they were looking for special mineral deposits of a mysterious substance that would help them with their ship construction. So Earth had some materials that the Space Brothers needed. And all of this leads to, in 1961, a movie with a missing quotation mark at the end there. That's humiliating, but it's a movie called Edge of Tomorrow, and that's where the picture on the right side of the screen is from. It's a shot. It was a movie about his encounter. Schmidt played himself, and there you have Mr. X and the other crew members in the spaceship. And there was a book. They reprinted his booklet that was his story to tie in with the film. It was directed by Ron Ormond, who also directed The Mesa of Lost Women, if you've seen that classic terrible movie, as well as what we might call Christian exploitation films of the late 60s and early 70s, such as If Footmen Tire You, What Will Horses Do? About the evil atheistic communist takeover of America. I heartily recommend it. I think you can find it on YouTube. In 1963, Reinhold is arrested, tried, and convicted of fraud charges after he takes tens of thousands of dollars from literally little old ladies for investments in a mining company that he based on his what he found on his flying saucer trips. During his trial, according to the newspapers, his lawyers played parts of the Edge of Tomorrow film to the jury as evidence in his defense. It did not work. He was convicted. He did a short prison stint and then faded away. I think he passed away sometime in the mid 1970s. So those are the six contactees that I thought are worthy of attention in one way or another. I think Reinhold Schmidt's lasting legacy is he is a resounding example of the way that the saucer field can be used as a tool for fraud. To finish up, some honorable mentions that I wanted to talk about, but there just wasn't time. Al Bender of Men in Black fame. Everybody remembers his encounters with the Men in Black and shutting down the International Flying Saucer Bureau, but fewer people remember his weirdly odd book from the later 1960s where he basically is a contactee and he goes to the Men in Black's planet of Kazik, which is how it's pronounced, Kazik. It's a weird book. He's rubbed all over with purple goo and ultraviolet light. Howard Menger backdated his contactee experiences to the 1920s when he met a previous incarnation of the woman he left his wife for, if I've got that right. Truman Bethram met Aura Raines, the lady space captain. Woody Derenberger met Indrid Cold and was integral to that complex of Mothman stuff back in the day. And his daughter Tanya later claimed to have met Indrid Cold as well, but Indrid Cold's dead, if you haven't heard. And Buck Nelson met a giant space dog, summarizing that story very quickly. But that is the countdown. Thank you. The show is at saucerlife.com, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram at saucerlife, and on Facebook at the Saucer Life Podcast. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer that. But that is the non-countdown countdown.
Well, thank you for that, Aaron. The UFO field is so strange in so many ways, not least of which because, through its evolution, the earliest UFO researchers went through that period where they just immediately rejected the contactees. And then they had with close encounters, and then close encounters of the third kind, and then abductions and whatnot. This idea that, well, there might be occupants of these things that we're studying, but there's always been like a real rejection of the contactees as just probably fraudulent.
Right.
And there's so many interesting aspects there's so many approaches one could take. Obviously, it's easy to write them off. They seem more like just traditional New Age spiritualist stuff for the 50s and 60s. And yet, I do think it's highly likely, I think it's indeed probable that many of them were having legitimate experiences. And it reminds me of John Keel's silent contactees, this idea that there were thousands of people experiencing these things who never look for any publicity, who as much as they may be getting the message that you should be proselytizing, they don't, or they do it on a much more, word of mouth level.
Right.
We did have a Red Pill Junkie ask you the obvious, what are your top modern contactees? Because it's certainly evolved now. It's completely different, or is it?
Whitley Strieber. I think he's the most recent book of his I read that I can't remember the name of, but it was very much in the vein of a contactee book, because he has a message, and it's never just been about the abduction experience, that we see back in Communion. I think Strieber's continued evolution over the years is very much in the vein of sort of an ongoing contact relationship, and I think we see him kind of struggle to understand it, as we're struggling to understand it as we read through his books. There's a lot of weird overlap in categories with contactees that I don't think we had as much back in the 1960s. I'm not a fan of a lot of the modern contactee stuff, to be honest. I think Whitley probably, whether he would sort of see it that way or not, I sort of see him as sort of, thematically closer to what was going on in the best of the 50s stories, as opposed to Ashtar Channel or Number 72, who has a blog somewhere.
Yeah, and Ashtar is a great example of how, like, channeling, which is its whole other subgenre, is an intimate part of this. But I mean, so much of the UFO contact experience, whether it's close encounters, contact, or abduction, involves perceived telepathy, getting messages, and channeling just being another way of that. And then there's those weird connections with the I forget if it's the Air Force, or I think it was some Project Blue Book people who actually did some experiments on the fly, seemingly with some contactees. There's just so much fascinating ways to look at it, and the idea that that I think has been brought forth with both the idea of psychics and shamans and so forth, that maybe there's this desire to be taken seriously, and when people aren't taking your actual legitimate experience seriously, you feel this need to invent more data, more evidence. And so this idea comes up over and over again of maybe they had a legitimate, real experience of some unknown, saw it through the lens of their own enculturation, but then when they weren't believed, felt like they compelled to create more evidence. I mean, obviously there are fraudulent people out there, but
and I think one of the things I sort of argue in the Extraterrestrials in the American Zeitgeist book is that, for some, I think Adamski is a good example of this. He had a relatively consistent message that he was discussing from the 1930s onward. And you can see the themes that come out in his sort of ethical and philosophical and political themes that come out in his Contactee books. You can see that in the pamphlets and things that he writes back in the 1930s and 40s before the flying saucer thing even starts. So I think for somebody like Adamski, he sees the flying saucer craze as a new vehicle to promote ideas he already had, which doesn't necessarily mean he didn't have some kind of encounter that inspired him to do this. But the encounter is sort of incidental to the message in some ways, and in some cases. And I think another thing is that I've argued in the past is that the flying saucer thing provides cover for what were at the time some fairly subversive messages about the dangerous effects of rampant capitalism and nuclear weapons. It's why you have people writing to the FBI saying, I think there's communists down at this flying saucer club, because they're talking about really weird things. And from a lot of the files I've looked at, it seems like what the FBI was mostly concerned about is when people like Frank Stranges or like Adamski claimed to have some kind of connection to the government that they didn't have. And so you do have some federal law enforcement investigation of this, but for the most part, especially sort of at the ground level of just flying saucer believers in their clubs, maybe saying some pretty, subversive things about the American way, they're not seen as a threat. There are bigger ideological threats out there. And so the flying saucer thing can provide some cover in that way.
And this is, again, there's so many angles that can be talked about. And I'm fascinated by this idea that, whether the American government and military felt that this was just, organic socialism, communism being expressed, or whether it was part of some greater plot or orchestrated stratagem, to use Vallet's turn of phrase. That I think this is an idea that Nick Fredfern's explored, and others, that maybe this was part of some actual campaign, but that's a whole other can of worms, obviously. So, well, thank you so much, Aaron. I really I suggest folks check out saucerlife.com. It's a great podcast. I listen to every episode intently and excitedly for the next one, and I'm glad that there's somebody like you out there who is an academic working in education and working also in these fields, because I do think the historical perspective is really important, and I think a little snark is okay. So,
well, thanks. And thanks for having me. And please, everybody, donate to the Anomaly Archives. And on the 23rd, our holiday special episode will come out. And
all right.
We're excited about that. I've got all of our guest voices in, having recorded them by themselves remotely, safely. And I'm really excited about the Commander X family Christmas letter that so we're going to see what's going on with the Commander X family this year. And we've got some examples of Krampus romance novels.
Oh my gosh.
So there's that. It's it's gonna be it's it's going to be fun. So that's coming up. Thanks for having me. Enjoy. I think Micah Hanks is up next with
He's
more
just,
UFO stuff.
Just coming on.
That'll be fun, and enjoy the rest of the streamathons throughout the rest of the year. And thanks again. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Aaron. Really appreciate it. All right, folks, that's Aaron Gulyas, who you can find at saucerlife.com. And you can, of course, go to our website and see all the links to his and our other presenters' works. We are inching along slowly. We've, broken that 10,000 halfway mark. So we're very happy about that. Still kind of going along at a snail's pace, but I understand it's tough out there, folks. So, but if you can give, we'd really appreciate it. We could really use your help. We're just approaching $10,100, and we can use all the help we can get. And coming up in just a minute, we'll have Micah Hanks. And so stay tuned, stay right where you are, and we'll be back in just a couple of moments or minutes. All right, folks. That is some of the work of my good friend Ken Adams, who we'll be hearing from in upcoming Streamathons. You can see more of his work at that link. It's a Vimeo page with a lot of his great stuff. Love his audio-visual work. It's mainly visual. He has some great musicians as well. But stay tuned. We will be back momentarily with Micah Hanks.